This week we read Parshas Balak. So the sugya we will be discussing tonight doesn't really have essentially to do with the neshama of the parsha, but there are no mitzvahs in this week's parsha, so we're looking for an interesting topic which in a way is associated with the psukim that we learn, and this is one of the more baffling sugyas, and a sugya I have thought about a lot, dealt with a lot, and this is a good opportunity to put it on Shulchan Malachim and to have an in-depth discussion of the concept of kavod habriyot. Godel kavod habriyot shedoicha lo yiseseh shebetoira. How do we define kavod habriyot? Which mitzvahs are overridden? I don't know how to say that. What do we override for kavod habriyot? And we'll generally discuss the concept of kavod habriyot. What does it have to do with this week's parsha? Well, has to do. So when Bilam sees his mule go berserk, and he doesn't know what possessed his mule and why she doesn't move forward as he would expect her to do, and she sees the angel, which he is not aware of. And then the malach turns to Bilam. V'yoyim malach Hashem al ma'okis v'sasoin chuzeh sholosh hagolam hinei onochi yitzosi lasoten ki yorat derech l'negdi v'tir'ani u'osoin v'teit lefonai zeh sholosh hagolam ulai notasomi ponai ki atu gam oischo horakti v'oiso hechiesi. And Rashi writes oiso hechiesi oischo horakti shelo yoim rezui shesolko es Bilam bitorchachto, v'lo yochol lahoishiv, chaz hamokom al kavod habriyot. V'chein es habeheimo ta'aroigi, v'horaktu es ha'isho ve'es habeheimo. Rashi writes, it is from here that we see שהקדוש ברוך הוא chas al kavod habriyot, and Rashi brings a source. How do we know shechas rachmon al kavod habriyot? That is a Mishnah in Sanhedrin Daf Nun Daled Amud Aleph. An animal that a person was over avera by, the animal is destroyed. Sheloi tahei behem holeches b'shuk v'habriyot omrim zui sheniskolo ploini al yodo. And that is something embarrassing, and therefore it is from here that we learn shechas hamokoim al kavod habriyot. So the basic sugyas and brochas yutasum in the base. Godel kavod habriyot shedoicha lo yiseseh shebetoira. But the Brisa says that amoitze klayim bevigdoi poishta afilu b'shok. If a person suddenly becomes aware and he's in a shus harabim, he's walking in the street and he finds that he has kilayim, by mistake he put on a garment that is shatnez, he has to undress even in Rishus Harabim. And the Gemara brings the posuk, Ein chochma ve'ein tvuna ve'ein eitza neged Hashem. And the Gemara asks, how do we reconcile this halacha with the basic principle of Godel kavod habriyot shedoicha lo yiseseh shebetoira? And the Gemara says, kavod habriyot overrides any isur derabanan, but not an isur d'oraisa. So what do Chazal mean when they said kavod habriyot shedoicha lo yiseseh shebetoira? We mean the loy says of loy tosur. All the Rabbanans are based on loy tosur mekol asher yegidu locho yomen usmoil, and that is the only loy tosur that is pushed aside by kavod habriyot. But kavod habriyot will never enable to transgress a isur d'oraisa. It is only an isur rabbanan that we override for kavod habriyot. And at the beginning of today's shir, we will bring 8 different examples, starting with the basic sugi and brochas daf yutes, moving on to other sugis, to the rishonim, to achronim, 8 different examples of isurim that we override because of kavod habriyot. And these many examples are based on 2 principles. Principle number 1, in the basic sugi brochas yutes in the base, lo tosur and isur derabanan, we validate, we are mati and isur derabanan b'mokom kavod habriyot. And the Gemara brings a raya from And Mishnah, Arei shahoyu hoylech lishchoit es pischoi v'lo mul es benoi, v'motzu meis mutal b'shus harabim, meis mitzvah. He is supposed to take care of the deceased. He is supposed to take care of that meis mitzvah, even though that will necessitate bitul mitzvahs mila, bitul mitzvahs korban pesach. And those are mitzvahs asay sheyesh bohem kores. And nevertheless, for kavod meis, we violate those mitzvahs. The Gemara says, sheval taisa shana. Many Rishonim learn from that Gemara that even in Issa D'Oraisa, if it's sheva al taisa, we will be over an Issa D'Oraisa mishum kavod habriyot. Others maintain that is halacha miuchedes, only meis mitzvah. And that is the Gezeres HaKosev. That seems to be Rashi's opinion, and Brochas Chof Medalev. The Gemara merely asks, but if you say, Ein Chochma, Vein Tvona, Vein Eitza Neged Hashem, how could you be over on Issa D'Oraisa Mishum Kavod habriyot? The Gemara says, Sheval Taisa Shaina. But we do not learn from Meis Mitzvah to any other source and any other Shaila to transgress an Issa D'Oraisa, even B'Shev Al Taisa, for kavod habriyot. So we have two examples in which we say that an Issa D'Oraisa will never be pushed aside because of kavod habriyot. Hamoitzi kilayim bebigdo. If it's shatnez D'Oraisa, if it's kilayim D'Oraisa, he needs to take that garment off even in rishus harabim. And the same would apply talas she'ene mitzuyes es kehilchasa. If you passel your tzitzis in rishus harabim, and you become aware that you don't have tzitzis shedim, and that is a masa and not a beged, if it's a rishus harabim D'Oraisa, you need to remove that garment, even though it's a rishus harabim and it's a question of kavod habriyot. But on the other hand, if it's a karmelis, a rishus harabim derabanan, that is a clear sugya menochas lamet ches omed beis. Chazal were matter, you do not have to remove that garment, even though it's a masa. So the Gemara tells the story of one of the great Amiroim. He was made aware that his tzitzis were puzzle, but he did not remove that garment because it was a karmelis. And a karmelis is an issa derabanan, and kavod habriyot overrides an Isser derabanan. And that is why we learn in Shabbos Tzadik Daled Omid Beis that if a mace is mutal bebezoin, if it's a karmelis, we could bring him into the rishus hayochid. If it's a rishus harabim D'Oraisa, no, only tiltul menatzad or tiltul al yedei kika vitinoik. But if it's a karmelis, kavod habriyot overrides an Isser derabanan. Two halachas in which we find that personal hygiene and personal cleanliness is also part of what the Chazal define as kavod habriyot. So if a person needs to go to the bathroom, well, I don't know how to say that in English. There are things we just don't say. We just don't talk about. But the Gemara deals with the question of a person that needs lasos tzrochav, and he doesn't have what to use. So he could either use leaves or stones, or those are muktzah. But Chazal were matir tilkul muktzah mishum kavod habriyot, because he's got to use something to just care for his basic personal hygiene. And the same rule applies in a different sugya in Erevin, Daf Mem Aleph Omed Beis, and it is there that we deal with Tchumen. A person that was taken chutz l'tchum, ein lo yelo daled ames. So he must spend his entire Shabbos confined in his daled ames. He needs to go to the bathroom. Where should he do it? So Chazal were matir, he should step aside and move out of his close proximity where people won't see him to go to the bathroom. That is an Isser derabanan of Tchumim. Because it's an Isser derabanan, Chazal were matter mishum kavod habriyot. So judging by the basic sugyas that we find in Shas, what is considered kavod habriyot to override an Isser Derabanan. Undressing in a Rishus Harabim, which is obviously extremely embarrassing. Kavod HaMeis, when a body is in Rishus Harabim, untended and b'derech bezoyin, and it's hot, it could be a very unpleasant situation that is defined as kavod habriyos, to override an Isser Derabanan. And the other two examples have to do with your personal hygiene and personal doing your needs and things that people do not do, b'rishus harabim, that once again would be defined as kavod habriyos. Those are the sugyas that we find in Shas, but in Poskim we find some additional examples. In Yoredesim in Shin Tzadik Siv Beis, person is a barber, that's his profession, and he's in the middle of giving someone a haircut, and he is told that a family member passed away, and he is ba'aninus, and he cannot work, but he just shaved half of a person's head. So does he finish doing the haircut, or he says, I'm a novel, come back in 30 days and I'll finish my job? So the Shulchan Aruch paskins, yes, he could finish that haircut. And the source of this halacha is in Mordechai. It's not a Gemara, but the Mordechai in Moyed Kotten, Siman Tov Tov Kuv Beis, says yes. And the same would apply if the person getting that haircut is an oval, the same rule will apply. So an oval or an oinen can't take a haircut, but if he's in the middle, and it would be extremely embarrassing to be between people, amongst people with half of your head hair cut off, then Mishum kavod habriyos, it is an Isser Derabanan, Dinei Avelis are Miderabanan, and therefore Mishum kavod habriyos we're matter. So we see that the Rishonim used their understanding and their insight and their, I don't know whether to say common sense, but it is common sense of Gedolei Torah, to broaden the scope of kavod habriyos beyond what we find in the basic sugyas. The definition of kavod habriyos, what would be considered kavod habriyos, we find additional examples. And another example that once again is the Rishonim, not a Gemara, and that is the Ritva Moed Kotten Daf Chov Zayin. The Ritva says an oval can't work. An oval is supposed to be confined and sit at home and focus on his grief and his sorrow and his mourning. And an oval is not supposed to work. But if an oval is an amukim she'emakirin, and nobody is going to care for him, and he feels uncomfortable schnorring or asking people for money, then he is entitled to work just enough to have food and just enough to sustain himself via me'avelis. And once again, that is mishum kavod habriyos. So basically, he could be shoyel al psochim, but Chazal said no. He does not have to be embarrassed and be shoyel al psochim, especially in a place where people don't know him, and therefore he could do his job in as much as is required just to sustain himself for the Yemei Avelis. Once again, Chacham Amor Matio, in a Sidra Boton of Avelis for Kavod habriyos. So either Cherfes Rov, or they're just stretching out his hand and asking people for donations, that would be embarrassing, and that would be defined as Kavod habriyos. One of the basic halachas in Dinei Muktzah that we learn is the din of Geraf Shel Rei. If you have something that smells awful or is repulsive, then even though it is basically Muktzah, but you could carry it out. And based on the halacha of Geraf Shel Rei, many people carry the garbage out on Shabbos. Now, this shiur today is not Hilchas Shabbos, so I would not be discussing the details of Geraf Shel Rei, which is a complicated sugya. Well, I've given many shiurim on Shabbos, and I wrote a great deal in Minchas Osha Masechet Shabbos. There's a lengthy discussion about Geraf Shel Rei. But there's an interesting Rashi in Beit Daf Lamed Vav Amud Beis, and Rashi says, what is the basic heter of Geraf Shel Rei? If it's Muktzah, why were Chazal Mekel? Mishum kavod habriyos. And I think that is somewhat of a surprise, that would be defined as kavod habriyos, because it is unpleasant for the person sitting at home, but is that embarrassing towards other people? It would not be the same, in my opinion, as having a person undress in Rosh Hashanah, which is extremely humiliating, or having a mace in a situation which is embarrassing to the family and to the mace himself, or a person not being able to care for his personal hygiene. But graf sholrei, well, you're sitting at home, it's unpleasant. I would define it as tsar. So in my shiurim, in Minchas Osha Masechet Shabbos, I wrote that if I would have my say, and many times I apologize, if I would be 5 or 6 or 7 or 800 years ago, I would say that the concept of graf sholrei is based on Oinig Shabbos. It is definitely detrimental to Oinig Shabbos. How could you expect a person to be happy? And isn't that the opposite of Oinig if he has to sit at home and there's an awful smell and something repulsive is right next to him? So my interpretation would be Mishum Oinig Shabbos Hekelo Chachomim B'Yisu Muktzah, but Rashi writes Kavod habriyot. And all the major poskim in Shulchan Aruch, starting off with the Levush and all the other Achronim after the Levush, all go in the footsteps of Rashi, kavod habriyot. So this kavod habriyot would be similar in a way to the kavod habriyot of muktzah, just to clean yourself after going to the bathroom, which is also something personal, not necessarily towards others, but you yourself feel bad. It is humiliating in your own eyes, not towards others, and that is defined by Chazal's kavod habriyot. So it shouldn't be a wonder that graf sholrei, even though it is not necessarily humiliating towards others, the din of graf sholrei is even when you're alone at home. You don't necessarily have guests, nobody else is around. We still have the heter of graf sholrei, and Rashi does define graf sholrei as kavod habriyot. Could I have a Mishnah Berurah Chelik Gimel, Hilchos Shabbos? I think somebody around here should be familiar with where the Spurim are. So that's number 7, and I think now we're up to number 8, and there's a very interesting psak of the Ramah, which we find in the Ramah in Hilchos Shabbos, but the basis of this psak is Tshuvas HaRamah. Well, we have the Tshuvas, amazing Tshuvas of the Ramah, and this psak is dealt with at length in Tshuvas HaRamah Semekuf Chofei, and the Ramah also brings it in Siman Shin Lametes Sif Hey. That is. Yes, that is exactly the point that I made. How do we define kavod habriyot? The basic source, Brachas Yutes, Kila Ayim, Poishtoi Bishuk. That would be an embarrassing situation. If a person needs to take his garments off at a Shusarab, that would be embarrassing. Meis b'Shusarabim. It is embarrassing to the family and to the meis. So when a person is deceased, we can't ask him how he feels about things. And there obviously is a big confusion, not only in popular belief, even in Chazal, there is confusion and there are conflicting opinions. To what degree are the deceased aware of what is happening in their surroundings and with themselves? That's a big machlokes in Bavli and in Yerushalmi. But the situation in which a mace is mutal bebezoim b'shusarabim is embarrassing. Graf sholrei is not about embarrassment towards others. It is about being in an unpleasant or unhonorable situation. I don't know exactly how to define it, but it is between a person and himself and not necessarily being embarrassed towards others. But I think that is similar to the two sugyas I mentioned from the Gemara in Eruvin and regarding the heter for a person to move out of his daladamis lasot et tzrachav, or the heter to use objects that are muktzah just to wipe himself clean. and that is also something which not necessarily is between him and other people, but in his own respectability between him and himself, and not necessarily towards others. So in Siman Shin Lametes, yes, so are we entitled, you don't have any tissue, you only have a roll of toilet paper, could you tear that paper? So yes, present day poskim say, if we're not cutting the paper b'mido, that might be an issa d'oraisa of machatech. But if you don't have ekpeda and cut it, to an exact size, you just tear the paper at random, that would not be an issa d'oraisa, and mishum kavod habriyot, we are matter an issa d'rabbanan. Yes, and that would be permissible. So in Siman Shin Lametes in the Ramah brings a story that actually happened. So in Tshuvas Ramah, Siman Kuf Chof Hei, the Ramah deals with a Maaseh Shahoyo, and there is also brought in Ramah Shin Lametes Siv Dalet. יש מתירים לקדש אישו בשבס, היכן שאין לו אישו ובונים, אף על גב דלא קיימלון הוכי, מכל מקום סומכים על זה בשעת הדחק, גם כי גודל כבוד הברייס. כמו שרגילים שלפעמים, שלא היו יכולים להשוות עם הנדוניה ביום שישי עד הלילה. So the chasana was planned for Friday afternoon. But the two parties, the two mechatonim, just couldn't work out an agreement. Why did they wait for the last minute? I have no idea. I wasn't there. But Maaseh Shahoyo Kachoyo, Lo Yochlo Lahashvois Imanedunya, and they were wrangling around, fighting around about who gives what and who gives how much. And Lo Yochlo Lahashvois Imanedunya B'Yom Shishi Ad Alaylo. The oisen achupe v'akedushim b'leil Shabbos hoel v'kvar echinu l'seuda v'lenesuin v'ze boishes gedoylo lekala v'lachosen em lo yakones as, and therefore the Ramu was matter mishum kavod habriyot. We're dealing with an issa d'Rabbanan. Ein mekachin is just like any other kinyan, any other transaction, which you can't do of Shabbos. It's a gzeira d'Rabbanan shemu yichtov, and therefore just call the chasana off and tell all the assembled guests, just go home and we'll make it another time. That is an extreme embarrassment. So as not to embarrass the chosan and the kala, the Ramo writes, and that was his psak, that they could do the kedushin, even though it's a Mishnah Masechet Beitza, then ein mekachin esu issue. But because we're dealing with kavod habriyot, and that would be a considerable embarrassment, sending everybody home and just letting everybody know that there's no chasana tonight, and therefore the Namur was Mekel. So beyond the basic criteria that we find in Chazal, we do see that Gedolei Yisrael in various different areas were Mekel and broadened the scope in additional situations which they defined as kavod habriyot. Which brings us to a fascinating machloikes between the Noidabi and the Divrei Chaim. And many Gedolim throughout the ages dealt with similar situations. They shouldn't be happening, but many things that shouldn't be happening happen in the course of human events and human endeavors. So the Noida Buddha deals with a situation in which a person had an illegitimate relationship with an Eishesish. And he did tshuva, and her husband knows nothing about it. Does he have to share his personal information? He knows. He's not an aide, but he knows better than anyone else because he was personally involved. And the Noida deals with an insane situation in which the person that had a kesher with that Eishesish actually married that couple's daughter. So now he is their son-in-law. Does he have to tell his shver about what transpired between him and his shviger many years ago? Because Eishesish is, that's the din of Soita, Surah Labala. And the Noida B'Yida takes it for granted that we're dealing with an extreme situation of kavod habriyot. It's a mechubedika family, and it is heart-wrenching. And the Noida B'Yehuda, his entire tshuva is focused on one question, one shaila. The machlokes between the Rosh and the Rambam in the din of a moitzi kilayim bebigdoi poshtoi afilu b'shus harabim. Machlokes Rambam and Rosh. And this machlokes is based on two different gerses that they had in the Gemara. The gersa of the Rosh is a moitzi kilayim bevigdoi, his own garment. Then the halacha is, if it's klayim diuraisa, poshtoi afilu b'shuk. The Rambam's gersa is not bevigdoi. A moitzi klayim, poshtoi afilu b'shuk. So the Rambam says, if a person identifies klayim in another person's garment, and that other person is not aware of it, I am supposed to let him know, and I am supposed to tear that garment off his back, even though he's a shoygig. He's not aware. I have to make him aware. That is the opinion of the Rambam. The Rosh writes no. The reason the gerus and the Gemara, according to the Rosh, is amoitzi klayim bevigdoi, it is only if you are aware, and therefore you're amazed. But if you see klayim in the garment of another person and he's not aware of it, it's an issa d'oraisa, but he's a shoygig, then you do not have to notify him in Rishus Harabim. Because kavod habriyot would override an issa d'oraisa b'shoygig. So the Noida B'Yehuda, the basis of the entire tshuva, halacha karambam or halacha karash. What's the halacha? The husband is not aware. So you would ask, what about the woman? She is aware. So this tshuva goes back 200 years, and the Noida B'Yehuda says, well, probably she's not a Talmud Chacham. She's aware of what transpired, but she might not be aware of the Isser of Soita Lebala. And therefore, the Noida B'Yehuda is dan lekan or lekan. At the end of his tshuva, he writes that, yes, he has to take this embarrassment upon himself and notify that other party, because the Noida B'Yehuda is a mechadash, a big chiddush. Kavod habriyot is doicha an issa d'oraisa b'sheva al taisa, and especially b'shoygeg, but only if it's a one-time issa. But if this is an ongoing issa his entire life, that is different. So the Noida B'Yehuda goes into details, and he says that young man doesn't have to say that he was personally involved. You know, he could just minimize the essential and necessary information without implicating himself. The Divrei Chaim deals with the same shaila, and he is lenient. The Divrei Chaim was the Tzanzarov, not only one of the great Hasidic leaders in his era, but one of the greatest poskim of that generation. So both the Noida B'Yehuda and the Divrei Chaim are chelak alaf or Chaim siman lamed. Interesting coincidence. That'll make it a bit easier for us to remember. There are two chalokim in Noida B'Yehuda, two chalokim in Divrei Chaim. Both, incidentally, are Oira Chaim chelak alaf siman lamed. Both the tshuva of the Noida B'Yehuda is machman, the tshuva of the Divrei Chaim is mekel. And the Divrei Chaim says one could rely on the opinion of the Rosh. He doesn't accept the svara of the Noida B'Yehuda that's mechalak between an Isser Chad Pami and an Isser Kol Yemei Chayov. And the Divrei Chaim is lenient. And he writes an interesting line, Kach nohagu gedoli Yisrael, in questions like this, to be lenient. So he also bases his ruling not only on his personal opinion, but on a Messiahs of Psak of Gedol Yisrael. That's what the Divrei Chaim writes. And I myself find difficulty, what does this have to do with kavod habriyot? What does it have to do with kavod habriyot? I mean, in many piskei halacha, just doing the right thing has to do with kavod habriyot. I think kavod habriyot is only when it's incidental. You found klayim, it is a freak situation in which you become aware that you're wearing klayim, dafkin rishus harabim. Usually when a person dresses up, he should know what he's dressing. So that is, an incident, an accident. He find climb in his garment, birshus arabim. The embarrassment has nothing to do with the direct kiyum mitzvah. The embarrassment is the fact that he has to undress on rishus arabim, and similar to other situations in kavod habriyos. But what are we dealing with? It is embarrassing to divorce your wife, but that is the din. If that is the din, yes, sometimes it's embarrassing to be a good Jew. Sometimes it's embarrassing to do the right thing. But if the din is that is the din of Saita, why would kavod habriyos have any weight or any relevance in this shaila? If that is the halacha, then that is the halacha. So, doesn't matter, al pi Torah, it doesn't matter whether you're a prince or a pauper, a king or a peasant. If a Saita is osa labala, then she's osa labala. And if she's osa labala, you have to divorce. And what?
It brings it to basic the kavod habriyos there.
So there is a Gemara, an amazing Gemara in Zvochim. Why b'mokom sheyishchet ha'oile yishchet hachatas, and both are shchitos and betzofen, ha'torah chosa al kvodon shel briyos. And when you bring a korban, it shouldn't be obvious whether it's a oila or a chatos. The shchita is both of the same place. No, not everybody has to see that you're bringing a korban chatos, but nevertheless you do bring a chatos, and you tell the kohen it's a chatos. And well, there are oinshin, makas mardas is an issa derabonon. It's a mitzvah derabonon. Give makas mardas. So would we say, Odom nechbad, we won't give him makas mardas? Kavod habriyos is doiche a mitzvah derabonon. But you need to pay the price for your follies. So what does it have to do with kavod habriyos? And if the din is that they have to divorce, so they could do it in as much as possible in a respectable way. They don't have to tell everybody what the story is and why they're getting divorced. So to me it is strange. The Noida B'Yehuda and the Divrei Chaim don't even delve into the question, would this be defined as kavod habriyos? The entire discussion is halacha Rambam or halacha Rosh. But they seem to take it for granted that this is a situation of kavod habriyos, and to me, this is a gewaldige chiddush.
Could it be the embarrassment of the son-in-law?
Not necessarily, because the Noida B'Yehuda is not dealing with that same story. 100 years transpired between the tshuva of the Noida B'Yehuda and the tshuva of the Divrei Chaim. We must assume that in every generation things go awry and things go wrong. They're not dealing with the same story. But they both are dealing with the question, do we have to notify a person that he, according to Din Torah, has to give a divorce to his wife, and it is a humiliating situation. But if that is the din, if I would have my say, I would say, what does that have to do with kavod habriyos? I mean, there are many situations in Dinei Oinshim in which kavod habriyos is involved. Well, at the beginning of the shir I said, some Rishonim maintain that kavod habriyos is doiche diuraisa b'sheva al taisa. Yes? So a very important member of the community was over on Chayiv Eskila, Chayiv Sefer, Mises Bezdin. Would we say Sheval Tais? It'll be a tremendous embarrassment for him, for his family, for the entire community. Mishum Kavod habriyos, we're doiche, a mitzvah d'oraisa b'Sheval Tais. So maybe we would not administer justice. It's Kavod habriyos. But if the embarrassment is directly incurred from kiyum mitzvah, then there's no other way about it, And therefore, it is a chiddush to me that the Noida B'Yehuda puts forth an assumption, and nobody challenged that assumption. And the Divrei Chaim and the Noida B'Yehuda, their entire machloikas is the halacha Rambam ukarash. So when the person transgressing is a shoygig and not amazed, do we still have to impose on him to take his garment or b'shus harabim? Would we still say, Enesa diuraisa overrides kavod habriyos, and to me, that is a big chiddush. So there's a very famous psak of Harav Ovadia Yosef, Zechat Tzaddik Levrocha, in Yabi Oim, Chelik Chesem and Lamed Beis, And he dealt with a situation in which a young married couple, happily married, and the husband was never aware that she was pregnant before she got married, before she ever got married. And that is information the husband wasn't aware of. Is that the right thing to do is a different question. That is not the discussion, and that is not the tshuva in Yabia Omer. But the question was, a year after the chasana, she had a baby, and the husband was so happy to do pidyon haben. There is no chiyuv of pidyon haben, because that baby was not peter rechem. But the husband knows nothing about that. So does she have to tell the husband, my dear husband, there is no pidyon haben, I'm sorry to tell you. Or, kavod habriyot, her personal kavod, not to humiliate and embarrass her in such a terrible way. She should have to share this information with her husband a year after their chasana, and Rav Avadia Paskins. Because a brocha levatol, according to most poskim, is an issa d'rabbanon, kavod habriyot doiche, issa d'rabbanon doiche loise shebetoira. Let him be happy, let him say the brochas, let them go ahead with the pidyon haben, and not humiliate that young lady. That's the psak of Rav Avadia Yosef and Yabi Omer. So this, in my opinion, would be more reasonable than the psak of the Noida B'Yehuda and the Divrei Chaim, because the humiliation here is not performing the mitzvah. To the contrary. The humiliation is letting the husband know that he cannot perform the mitzvah of pidyon haben. And I agree with that psak, even though it seems to be a big chiddush, but he has a predecessor, and before Rav Avadia, and you could trust the Abiyah Omer that he didn't oversee the tshuva in Marshag. Tshuvas Marshag was one of the great Gedolim in Hungary. Reb Shimon Greenfeld, he was the Rav in Semihai, Cheder Gimel Samachei. He deals with a very similar question, and his ruling is the same. That Mishum Kavod habriyot, the Yisrael Brocha Levatol is only an Yisrael Rabbanan, according to the vast majority of poskim, and therefore, Godel Kavod habriyot shedoiche loise shebetoira. So many of the sources I brought today are new definitions and new areas of kavod habriyot. And one could argue, Ein lanu elo divrei chachamim. So where do we draw the line? Almost everything could be defined, every shas atchak, in every situation. Where would we draw the line? And I just want to bring a very important source who already makes this argument. Where do we draw the line? So there's a tshuva in Rivash. Tshuvas HaRivash, Siman Reish Chavav, deals with the question: a person had a baby and chalamoid, and they have to get ready for the bris. All he has is shmatas. He doesn't have a proper suit. And it's very embarrassing to come to the bris of his own son dressed up in an inappropriate fashion. And the question that the Rivash is dealing with, well, if we assume that malachas chalamoid is midarabonon, which is a big argument into itself in Sementov Kuf Lamed and Beis Yosef, many Rishonim maintain malachas chalamoid also min haTorah. Others argue if Chazal were lenient bedover or oved, it can be an issa diuraisa. How could we be making an issa diuraisa for monetary loss, for dover or oved or tzorech hamoyed? So the Rivash says, even if we assume that it's an issa derabanan, this would not be defined as kavod habriyot. So you don't have a nice suit. So what? If you can't afford a nice suit, you don't have a nice suit. And the Rivash makes the argument, Ein ledamois milsa la milsa. And it's in a very powerful argument. I mean, how do we define kavod habriyot? What we find in Chazal are extreme situations. And some of the Rishonim already make the distinction between Gnai Godol, like Poshto Yafila Bishuk. So, all we could say is that Gedolei Yisrael throughout the ages did use their judgment and did take the liberty to broaden the definition of kavod habriyot beyond what we find in the Gemara. So let's just go back to the examples that we find in the Rishonim and the Poskim throughout the ages that are beyond what we find in the Gemara. Person is in the middle of shaving or taking a haircut, and either the barber or the barbed, I don't know, either the barber or the guy taking the haircut is an ovel before he finished the job. Kavod habriyot, that is the Mordechai, and it's a psaken Shulchan Aruch. I think it's a bigger chiddush to say you're in a strange community. Nobody knows you there. So to save you the embarrassment of asking for nedavis, the Mordechai, the Ritva, says you could work, even though an ovel is not supposed to be working. The Ramah, paskening that mishum kavod chosam v'kala, you don't call off a wedding after the guests are already here, and he's matter in Isser Derabanan. Graf Sharei, but I want to make an interesting comment. Rashi writes Graf Sharei is mishum kavod habriyot. But by Graf Sharei, we're only makel in muktzah, not in karmelis. It's halacha mefereshes, you cannot carry a Graf Sharei out to a karmelis. Mishum kavod habriyot, they were matter karmelis, b'meis, and meis mishum kavod habriyot, you could take him out to a karmelis. Nobody is matter taking a Graf Sharei out to a karmelis. So our definition of Rashi is a limited kavod habriyot, not the same. Muktzah is not chomor kereshus harabe midirabonon, because by a karmelis we're dealing with a shvus, with one of lametes malachas derabonon, which is chorma mamuktzah. So even though Rashi defines Graf Sharei mishum kavod habriyot, it is not the same as kavod habriyot of the Gemara, because by Graf Sharei they were only makel is a muktzah, not as a karmelis. How about everything that's associated with asiyas tzrochim? So on one hand, they were mater muktzah, using rocks, leaves, grass, that's muktzah. But on the other hand, they were matir chutz l'tchum, going out of daladamis if you're out of the tchum. So we do find different heterim in kavod habriyot. So the Ramah deals with calling off a wedding, sending home the guests. That would be defined as kavod habriyot. And then the various different psukim, from the Noida B'Yehuda to the Divrei Chaim to the Marshag to the Abiyah Omer, saving people the embarrassment of disclosing information about their past follies and causing extreme embarrassment, whether it's divorce or it's a young wife telling her husband that he cannot do a pidyon haben because she had a child or before they were actually married, and that is a big chiddush. Kavod habriyot basically is defined as preventing or avoiding embarrassment or humiliation. And Chazal teaches us in Gittin, Godol habusha, kamtza ubar kamtza. That was the trigger or the catalyst that brought about Chorban Beis Hamikdash, because a person was humiliated. Would the same apply to tsar? I don't know whether you're familiar with the story of the B'samim Roish. 250 years ago, one of the Rabbanim printed a Sefer B'samim Rosh. He argued that those are tshuvas of the Rosh and some other Rishonim. And he got beautiful askomas from many of the Gedolim of that generation. I'm an Einikel of Rab Mordechai Bennett. And I have a somewhat guilty conscience that I have the B'samim Rosh at home, because Rab Mordechai Bennett went out against that Sefer with fire and brimstone. And he writes, not only is it a forgery and a ziyuf, there are also very problematic tshuvas in there, and he says that it doesn't smell good, it doesn't seem good. And he writes that there's minus in that sefer, ba'al tashkem ba'orlecho avlo. So I'm an Einikal of Ramot Chamenet, so why do I have that sefer at home? Because Rabbi Akiva Eiger quotes him in a few places. So if Rabbi Akiva Eiger quotes him, then the Chassam Sofer in one of his tshuvas writes, Kizvei Harosh. And when the Chassam Sofer was reprinted some 50 years ago, the publisher thought it's a Toas Atfus, and he wanted to fix it to Kisvei Harosh, till he was made aware it's not a Toas Atfus. The Chassam Sofer accepted the ruling and the opinion of Ramot Chabenet, and therefore he calls that Sefer Kisvei Harosh with a Zayin and not with a Tuf. Maloshin Sheker V'Kozov. So, one of the more problematic tshuvas in that Sefer, B'Somem Rosh Simen Reish Pei, when he is asked, B'Mukim Tsar, could we be mater and Issa Derabonon? And he writes, yes, all Isurim Derabonon are pushed aside B'Mukim Tsar. And he brings a raya from Sukkah, a mitzvah potem in a Sukkah, and also from the din of Gerneach, Yoine Kafilu B'Shabbos, B'Mukim Tsar Etiru, Malucha Shein Tzicha Legufa, Shabbos Kuf Zayin. And the Moitzila Or of the Sefer, the publisher, the one that gave the Sefer to print, added his comments on B'Somem Rosh B'Shem Kasa, the Harsana. And he brings a raya to this ruling of the from kavod habriyot. God kavod habriyot shedoicha lo yisas shebetoyre lo yisas doicha is l'rabonon. So why would there be a difference between tsar and humiliation? That's the kasad arsana. Rab Meir Simcha, or Samech Rambam, Perik Tezvov in Hilchas Sanhedrin, Halacha Aleph. He doesn't quote the sefer by its name, but he attacks a sefer in which the publisher in Siman Reish Pei, interesting, he writes the Siman, but he doesn't mention the name. So to me, it's obvious that if you know what I'm talking about, you could go and check it, but he doesn't want to mention the name of the sefer. So Or Sameach, Hilchas Sanhedrin, Perik Tezvov, Sif Aleph, he totally rejects this mishva'ah, this argument, the similarity between Tsar and kavod habriyot. And Rab Meir Simcha writes, Ein l'lamoid Tsar me kavod habriyot. Ha-mitzvah poter min ha-sukkah, but we don't find mitzvah that's poter of any other mitzvah. It is a sif meforsh in Shulchan Aruch Siman Tov Ayin Beis, mi she'eino shoyse yayin, mipnei she'yayin mazikoi, tzorech litchuk atzmoi, and he has to drink wine. And the source is, it's a Gemara in Bavli and in Yerushalmi, Rav Yehuda or Rav Yoina. In Bavli and Yerushalmi, we find two different names. Drank dalat koises, and they suffered from headaches till Shavuos, from Pesach till Shavuos. And based on that Gemara, Shulchan Aruch says, even though you're pained and you suffer by drinking wine, you're still mechuyev to drink dalat koises. It's a mitzvah derabonon. So mitzvah is not poter from a mitzvah derabonon. So that is one of the more questionable shuvas that we find in that Sefer B'Somem Rosh. However, and sometimes it is not only substance that matters, but style as well. Nobody is mefakpik about the greatness or the authenticity of the Or Zarua. And in Or Zarua, Chelik Beis Siman Vav, the Or Zarua writes that if a mitzvah is potem in a sukkah, even though sukkah is a mitzvah d'oraisa, one could learn that a mitzvah is potem from a mitzvah d'rabonon, which is similar to the B'Somem Rosh. However, the difference is the Or Zarua deals with a specific case of Tsar Gadol. The B'Somem Rosh speaks in the broadest sense. Kol isurim derabonon are mutar b'mukim tsar. That is what brought on him the wrath of Reb Mordechai Benet, of the Or Sameach, and many other gedolim. So Chavas Yor, Tshuvas Chavas Yor Siman Kuf Tzadik Aleph. There's an interesting tshuva. A kohen was out in the yard, and it was bitter cold, the middle of the winter. And while he was out in the yard, he just went out for a few moments to take care of something, he was notified that there's a nifter in the house. And if we stay in the yard till that nifter will be taken care of, that is extreme suffering and hardship and difficulty. It's very, very cold. We could assume in the mid-European winter, is he entitled to just pass through the house and go to a neighbor's house to just have shelter from the bitter cold of the winter? And the Chavasio argues, according to the Shach we discussed, I think, a week ago by Tumas Koyanim, that Tumah Iveres Mabayis Rabayis is only a Tumah Darabonon, and we're dealing with Tsar. And the Chavasio makes the same argument. If we're lenient by kavod habriyot by Nisa Darabonon, maybe extreme Tsar would be the same. So we do find some of the greatest legitimate Gedolim that made a similar argument. If kavod habriyot is doichen Nisa Darabonon, maybe extreme Tsar would be no less than kavod habriyot. But once again, the Chavasio deals with a specific case. And it is an extreme case. It is a bitter winter and the person is out there in the yard. And that he doesn't say it's a sakana, he doesn't deal with pikuach nefesh, but he does argue that we could be matter in Issa Darabonon of Tumas Koyanim b'mokem tsar, similar to the Or Zarua. But one can definitely not argue that all the Asurim Darabonon are mutter b'mokem tsar. We find many sugis in Shas that prove to the contrary. For instance, the Sif Meforsh in Shulchan regarding Dalet Koises, B'misha Hayayin Mazikoi. So we discussed the sugi of kavod habriyot, and I did not come out with any clearer guidelines. And the questions are many. How do we define kavod habriyot? What are the limits of kavod habriyot, and exactly which asurim do we override for kavod habriyot? But we did deal with many interesting sources, and what I think is of extreme importance is the tshuva of the Rivash, and the Rivash takes us back 600 years. The Rivash was a Talmud of the Ran, and he writes, Ein ledamo ismel sanamilsa, even though we do see that many Gedolim did exactly that. They were medama milsa milsa, but we must assume that it must be an extreme case of a kavod habriyot and not something which is more commonplace and not so extreme. Yes, calling off a wedding when the chosen and kala are present and the guests are assembled, I think everybody would agree that would be extreme humiliation and embarrassment, or similar cases which we have discussed from Gedolei HaPoskim. So as I said, we learn from the sugi of Kamsa bar Kamsa, Ad heichon hadavura magiyim, and Chazal say, Hamal ben pnei chaveru berabim, ein lo chelek le'olam habo. I don't know where Chazal say that, but it is quoted by many. I don't think it's a Chazal. But what we do find 4 different times in Shas is mutav sheyapel odom esatzmo lekiv shanowesh va'al yalbem pnei chaveroi berabim. And Tosfos and Sotah does maintain that albonis porim is yehereg va'al yavar. Even though in Minchas Osher and Bereshis I wrote that is extremely unreasonable to say that albonis ponim is yehereg va'al yavar. And why do I think it is extremely unreasonable? Because albonis ponim could be reconciled. You could apologize. You could forgive. But giving away your life, yehereg va'al yavar, is something which cannot be rectified. And it is an amazing Rambam, Perek Aleph of Hilchos Mila. And many Achronim have difficulty with this Rambam, even though to me it seems so appealing. When the Rambam writes, and he brings the halacha of Tinuk Shemeso Echov Machmas Mila, we push off the Mila. because it is a sakana. And we don't take any chances, we don't take any risks when dealing with pikuach nefesh. Pikuach nefesh doiche kol ha-mitzvahs shebetorah. So that is a very simple halacha. And the source is in Yuma Pehei, Pikuach Nefesh Doiche Kol HaTorah Kula, besides Gimel Aveias Chamuris. But the Rambam writes, because any mitzvah you could rectify. Maybe you'll be Mekayim some other time. But Nefesh HaOdam She'ovad, nobody could bring it back. So many Achroinim deal with the question, Ma'iko Mashmalon, what does the Rambam want to be Mekadesh? I think knowing the Rambam, it shouldn't be any surprise at all. In many sources, not only in Moira Nevuchim and in other sources, even in Mishnah Torah, in many sources, the Rambam is Moisef Tam v'Tavlin, Ma'oy Megdatoi v'Roichav Datoi bebiur mitzvahs Torah. And the Rambam just wants to explain why is it that Pikuach Nefesh Doiche Kol HaTorah Kula. Because every Aveda, you could make up for it. You could do tshuva, you could rectify. When a person's life is lost, it's lost forever. In this world, well, we believe in Olam HaNeshamas. That is the Ikar HaChaim, Chaya Netzach. But by halachic perspective, it is here and now. So therefore, is the dinya hereg v'alyava not to humiliate another person? To me it would seem extremely modna. So I have a different pshat in Toisus in Saita. But I won't go into that because Minchas Osher, I think it's by the Parsha of Yehuda V'Toman. I don't remember which simon it is. In Minchas Osher, Chumash Bereshis, there's a lengthy discussion. But what we do learn from this Mama Chazal, Noyach leila odam sheyapal asatzma lekif shelueish v'al yal ben pnei chaveroi berabim. And therefore it is no wonder that Chazal were extremely careful with kavod habriyot. Ad she'amru gadol kavod habriyot shedoicha lo yisesa shebetorah. V'gedoy lahabusha she'arei al kamtza ubar kamtza chor v'Yerushalayim, like the Gemara says in Masechet Gittin. So Daf Pei Heya Mesechet Psuchim, there's a very interesting Gemara. And it's a machlokes in the poskim whether it is a Gemara or not. Kol ma she'omer lechu bal habayis asay, chutz mitzay. So some poskim argue, no, that's a mistake in Gerasa. It isn't the Gemara. But in the Vilna Shas, it isn't the Gemara. Well, it's in brackets, but it's still in the Gemara. And there's an interesting Sfas Emes. And the Sfas Emes says, after the story of Kamtza and Bar Kamtza, that is when Chazal were metaken. Kol masha oimer lecho barabayis asay chutz mitzay. If he wants to throw you out and embarrass you in the presence of others, he has no right to do that. So that is an interesting chiddush of the Sfas Emes. Why chutz mitzay? That is a special halacha that Chazal were metaken after the tragedy of Kamtza and Bar Kamtza, and after they saw what were the consequences we had to bear. B'chor Mabayis, it is then that they said, yes, the Balabayis could impose on his guests whatever he wishes, but chutz mitzay. You cannot throw a man out of your house and embarrass him in the presence of others. So how important this is, and how careful we have to be not to hurt other people's feelings. And this is just an example of midas and mitzvahs shebein odam lachaveroi. Mitzvahs shebein odam lamakoim osa tshuva mischapaloi. Mitzvahs shebein odam lachaveroi ad she'eratze es chaveroi. And we see in this halacha as well that Chazal are more machmir b'mitzvahs shebein odam lachaveroi than mitzvahs shebein odam lamakoim. So we have to be extremely cautious and extremely careful when dealing with other people, not to hurt their feelings, and especially not to embarrass them in the presence of others. And we should always be mar bekvoid habriyot and bekvoidon shel Yisrael and have an ayin tov velerot b'shivchon shel Yisrael. And we should be zoiche bekorev b'yomeinu to Yeshua's Yisrael and be as goyel tzedek b'meheru b'yomeinu.